everyone, we're just going to have a quick look at the hormones during the menstrual cycle, but we're going to look at it from a graph perspective. I know I did go over it in the PowerPoint, but I did want to go over this a little bit further. So when we look at this, it's really important that we memorize these hormones and know the purpose of this. The first hormone we are going to start with is our FSH. So if we go back to our notes, what does FSH do? FSH is going to take a follicle and develop that follicle into a mature egg, which, if we look at this, mature egg, that needs to be done before ovulation. Going back to our notes, ovulation is going to occur at day 14. So when we look at this, we will notice, if we map out our FSH, that FSH is going to spike before ovulation. It is not the highest of the hormone levels, but it does take a spike before day 14, which when we look at the purpose of FSH, it needs to mature that egg. So FSH rises right here. The egg will be mature. It is then going to be released on day 14, which will then in turn lower my FSH levels. Okay, our next hormone we are going to look at is our LH. Okay, so remember, if we go back, the purpose of LH is, first of all, it's going to stimulate estrogen. Okay, it's going to trigger ovulation. So when we look at this, when we track our LH, which is this line here, okay, our LH once again is going to spike before day 14, which is on average the day of ovulation in most females. So the reason behind it is that in order to get estrogen production, we need to have LH, and we need to go back to our loops that we copied down, is that LH is going to be above that estrogen. So your LH will spike before, which will then stimulate the ovulation, which is the release of that egg. But then when we start to look at it, we can see the estrogen. Where does estrogen then spike? Well, LH spikes here. As soon as our LH spikes, we will then see a spike in estrogen. Okay, so that is going to lead us into our estrogen. Now, estrogen in the 28-day cycle is going to have two spikes. It is going to spike before ovulation, it'll then decrease, and then it's going to spike again after ovulation. So two things that are happening. We see that our estrogen is spiking here, and this is due to LH production, because we know LH is a tropic hormone. When we look at it, LH will sit on top and will then produce our estrogen. Okay, when we look at the purpose of estrogen, it's going to stimulate the development of the endometrium. But the other thing that it's going to do is it's going to provide positive feedback to the pituitary in order to release LH. So, which means our estrogen provides that positive feedback to the pituitary, which then allows my LH to then spike again. Now, when we look at our estrogen levels here, why do we need our estrogen levels high here? Well, estrogen also is going to thicken that endometrium, which needs to occur before ovulation, which will then allow that possible implantation of that egg and sperm into that endometrium wall. Okay, our last hormone that we have to talk about would be our progesterone. Now, when we look at the path of progesterone, it remains fairly low until after ovulation. Why? Well, when we go back and look at what structure produces progesterone, it is our corpus luteum, which is a structure that is produced after that egg is released. So we have our egg being released here, which then will produce that structure of the corpus luteum. When that corpus luteum is left, before it degenerates, it's going to allow that progesterone levels to spike. And the purpose of my progesterone levels is to maintain that endometrium. So we want that endometrium to stay from that day 14 to 28, so that if fertilization does occur and implantation is occurring inside the uterus on that endometrium wall, that it's going to be thick enough and that hormone is going to allow that endometrium to stay in hopes that that implantation will occur. Now, the second picture. I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but I did want to draw your attention to a little bit of this. So looking at this is a nice graphic organizer that is going to explain to you the FSH and your LH and where it targets in here. Now, the one thing I did want to draw to your guys' attention is that we are looking at the ovaries. So I know in our endocrine system, we did talk about that your reproductive hormones will generally target your ovaries, but what we need to look at a little more specifically is what exact reproductive structure that these hormones will target. So your FSH will typically target your growing follicle. Your LH will go to your corpus luteum, which will then in turn produce progesterone. Now, this next graphic organizer, which I will have uploaded on Google Classroom, is giving us two scenarios. After the egg is released, if there is fertilization, and this is where topic 3 will go into next week, but fertilization is when you have that egg and sperm uniting. So when we have that egg and sperm unite, the term that is used is fertilization. Fertilization will then produce a structure called a zygote. That zygote is now embedded into that endometrial wall, which will produce HCG, your human chorionic gonadotropin. Your HCG hormone is the hormone that is typically used to detect in pregnancy tests. So this is a hormone that will just be present if implantation does occur in that endometrium wall. But then what happens is we have our corpus luteum that is going to stay. That corpus luteum that typically will degenerate if fertilization does not occur will stay, which will then continue to produce progesterone and estrogen and continue that loop of negative feedback. So leading into topic 3 is going to be what happens after this, and more in the specifics into that development after that stage of fertilization. The other thing we need to look at is, what if there's no fertilization that occurs? Your corpus luteum will degenerate. Your progesterone and estrogen levels will decline. Where if we look at in comparison to here, if there was fertilization, your progesterone and estrogen levels will remain high. Two things then is when these levels decline is that it's going to turn off the FSH and FSH, and that relates back to our negative feedback loops, is that if these are going to decline, it's going to impact this as well, and the follicle will then develop and ovulation will occur again. On the other side here is your uterine contractions will begin, and these are typically referred to as when a female gets cramps, and the endometrium will shed. And once that endometrium sheds, we're back at the beginning of our 28-day cycle. Typically, the endometrium shedding, this is represented in the flow